Welcome to Goodwin Law Unplugged, Florida real estate and more. This podcast features candid insight from real estate industry professionals from all sectors. Your host, attorney Matthew Goodwin, a native Floridian and experienced real estate attorney, will provide his personal insight on legal matters and feature other professionals offering their candid advice. Whether you're a first-time homebuyer, seasoned investor, or experienced real estate agent, there is something for everyone. Thanks for joining us on Goodwin Law Unplugged.
Well, welcome back, listeners. Charlie McDermott, co-host, producer of Goodwin Law Unplugged, back in the Goodwin studio with Matt. Matt Goodwin, how you doing?
I'm good, Charlie. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. I'm still recovering from that last episode. I mean, you covered so much important information that's going to benefit realtors, future homeowners, or hey, commercial doesn't matter. And this is, again, just to cue up our listeners, a series of really important, frequently asked questions that Matt and his team at Goodwin Law get all the time. And you spent the time in the first episode to cover, the actual real estate contract and when it becomes a binding offer, and walked us through the offer process, the counter offer process, the acceptance. And now we've morphed into hey, how do we determine the effective date of your real estate contract? So, Matt, are you ready? Have you recovered from the last one?
I have, and I'm really excited to talk about this. This shouldn't take nearly as long to cover, though we get just as many questions. Yeah, so the effective date really is important because many of the timelines in the contract are tied to it or relate back to it. So it's an official term, it's a named and defined term in the contract. And what the contract, remember, we're talking about the FAR bar as is contract that's used in arguably 90% of the transactions in the state of Florida for residential property. And paragraph 3B of that sales contract states that the effective date of this contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counter offer, aka effective date. So we're going to talk about the timing. We'll focus on the timing aspect of this because there's a lot of things intertwined with other timelines that are tied to the effective date. But what we often see are buyers make an offer, it's accepted, maybe with a modification by the seller. So you have a counter offer situation. Yeah. Buyer initials the counter offer the following day, but doesn't date it. Question is, when is the effective date? So an example, buyer made an offer on a Saturday morning. Yeah. Seller signed it late Saturday evening, but did not deliver it back until Sunday. When is the effective date? That's a really, really good question, right? Because remember, the contract states that it has to be, it's the date when last signed and delivered. So if it's not delivered till Sunday, but the contract states that it was signed on a Saturday,
right?
Technically, the effective date is not until Sunday. And when those contracts come through our office to process, we are determining what the effective date is based on the face of the contract. And in this situation, it's technically ambiguous, and that one day could be off. So I'm going to tell you about some of the best practices at the end here. But dating it and delivering it is key, and try to do it on the same day. That's the bottom line. So in that scenario, Sunday would be the effective date, and all time periods would start tomorrow, which in this case would be Monday. But if you end up with some ambiguity, it's really good to convey in writing right at the beginning, hey, we agree that the effective date is X, right? And then make sure we know if you've agreed to something other than what's dated on the contract. So how do you calculate? Here's another question. How do I calculate counting my escrow period when the effective date is on a Friday? So parties make an offer, it's accepted. The effective date when it was delivered and signed by everyone is Friday. Your deposit says it's due in 3 days after the effective date. Counting starts tomorrow, which is Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Monday's the third, 3 days after the effective date. Your deposit is due Monday. If you don't get it in, you're in breach under this form of the contract. There's other forms that don't require that time of the essence is not key to this timeline, but I just want to focus on this one because I think this affects most of the transactions.
So
now I'm located in Collier County, and I have to add this because we use a different form of contract here. And when it comes to the deposit in particular, the time period that's stated on the contract does not necessarily make the buyer in default. Okay. Now we could draw that situation out and say, well, what does it do? Well, you have the right to demand that the buyer make their deposit, but because time is not of the essence as to the deposit and only as to the closing date in the Naples board form of the contract, then buyer can still make their deposit, say, on Tuesday and have a binding contract.
Okay.
You were going to ask a question. What's your question?
Well, it was just going back to what we just went through. President's, and I think you may have just answered that. President's Day was Monday, federal holiday. So what happens in that case? But yeah,
I'm glad you brought that up, and that's why I talked about how we're going to focus on timing at the beginning, because there's really a lot of analysis that goes along, and the time periods are calculated a little bit differently. But what the miscellaneous provisions of the sales contract state is that if any time period ends on a weekend, so Saturday, Sunday, or a legal federal holiday, then the deadline shall move to the next business day. So in that scenario with President's Day, buyers effective date's Friday, deposits due in 3 days, it would bump to Tuesday being the effective date. And part of that has to do with you can't deposit money into a bank and have it clear unless the banks are open, and the Federal Reserve's closed on President's Day and most federal legal holidays, and obviously Saturday, Sunday.
Okay.
But we do get that question a lot, Charlie, because many people just don't read the entire contract. If you did read the entire contract, you still may have to bounce around. And every time we get a question, even though we've read a certain provision 100+ times, we still have to apply that specific fact pattern when analyzing the black and white of the contract.
Yeah.
So good question.
No, I was just going to add, and that's where your expertise comes into play in your team. It's just that little change in a few words can make all the difference in the world in a deal not going through, whether you're the buyer or the seller. I had another question, and now, of course, it escapes me, but it had to do with the timing. I'm going to pass until it comes back into my head. Any other pieces of this from a timing standpoint that we should be?
Yeah.
It came back.
Right.
I just remember going through my recent transactions with my realtor, and because we had offer, counter offer, went back and forth, both with the property that we sold and the property that we purchased. And I was always like, but when is the deadline? That was always a question, because I would lose track and all that. So is the, as you go back and forth, and I know you covered this in the last episode, but for those who didn't listen to that, there's that counter offer. Let's say you get that kind of 2-day grace period we talked about in the last episode, right? So typically, is there a date in that counter offer, or do they like using again the President's Day weekend? Let's say the counteroffer is made on a Friday. Does that agreement then have that next Tuesday's date as the kind of the deadline, or is it just the 2 days from the effective date of the counteroffer?
That's a good question. So remember, we got to look at a counteroffer the same way we would as initial offer. And we're talking about effective date. So you have to sort of forget about the 2-day period at this stage, because we're assuming that 2-day period's been, the counteroffer was accepted within the 2-day period.
Okay.
If the counteroffer was accepted in the 2-day period, then the timeline starts when the last of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered the final counter offer. So going back to what the contract states in paragraph 3B, the effective date of this contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counter offer. That's your effective date.
Okay.
So if the counter offer is made on a Friday and the buyer doesn't sign it until Sunday, then the time period can start on that Monday, and it will. It always starts the tomorrow, right? Okay. Sunday's the effective date of the final counter offer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday's 3 days. Your deposit's due on Wednesday.
Okay.
And
then
Sunday.
Establishing the effective date, Matt, I know in my case, everything was electronic. Is that the norm? So once all the documents are signed, it kind of automatically gets stamped a date and a time, or there?
No, it doesn't. Okay. You can deduce the date by looking at certain programs, and you could roll back to the emails and but then you have the situation where you have to prove it, right? Yeah. So it's best to have it physically dated on the contract. And most forms that are done electronically, you'll have to manually add a field for the date. Or if you're doing it by hand, you would have to manually write the date in. And that's one of the best practices that I want to talk about. Initial and date all changes. So buyer makes an offer, it's dated, seller accepts it on a Saturday. Changes something, though, comes a counteroffer. Monday, buyer counter initials. It becomes a final counteroffer, but forgets to date it. Well, they signed it on Monday.
Right.
It doesn't have a date other than the one when the seller made their counteroffer. But you can prove it was delivered on that Monday. Well, I would argue that Monday is your effective date. But what happens often is there's more than one change made by the seller, and there's more than one modification made by the buyer to that counter offer. And that's where it starts to get a little muddy. You end up seeing one page with 6, sometimes even 10 different places that are initialed, and there's no dates next to them. How do you know which change was made when? So it can really get confusing. And if you end up in a situation with multiple changes, but there's a binding contract, I suggest writing up a clean offer and having it modified to the final counteroffer terms. And it's funny because if you go through that process, you may forget when the last change was made. So you really have to stay on top of these details when you're sending offers back and forth and negotiating. If you can avoid, look, everybody has their own method and way of doing business, but the buyers and sellers need to be keen to this, because if they are, then they can keep their realtors keen to it as well. And sometimes it works the other way around, which it really should. But the end of this contract states that the buyer and seller, the parties, should consult legal counsel before signing this contract, right? So unless your realtor is a lawyer, you really can't hold them accountable because you signed it. And these are 12 pages long. So going back to this effective date, the other consideration is the time of day. So what is the effective date if the seller sends back the offer at 10 o'clock the same night?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is a provision in here that talks about timing, but you have to really be aware of this. And there used to be, so certain contracts will have an actual time of day, 5 p.m.
Okay.
Other contracts use 11:59 p.m. If time is of the essence as to the offer and acceptance dates, and you put in there a time of day and they send it back after, then it's too late. All right. Most of the time you won't see that happen. But just be aware of that. And it's good to ask the question and see if the contract says anything about the time of day.
And if there is no time of day, is it assumed that it's 11:59 at the end of that day, or?
That's a great, so I hate to use the word assume because we know what happens when you assume, but in some cases you have to use deductive reasoning to make an assumption. So you have this implicit assumption is there's no time there, then the day technically ends at 11:59, right? If you get it in at 11:59 and 59 seconds before the 12, technically you're good.
I've done that with my taxes a few years. So I mean, it works in the IRS. It must work here.
I've done that with property tax payments because they have to be date stamped before you can get that discount in the month. And if the property appraiser's office receives it the following month, but it's date stamped the previous, then that's good enough.
Yeah.
Right. So look, that's why you got to understand timelines. This effective date is something that's often missed. And one of the areas it really creates the most problems is the inspection periods. Also the closing date and the loan approval periods. We're not going to talk about those because those are episodes in and of themselves. We will talk about the inspection and repair provisions of the standard versus as is, but because they're so convoluted, I'm not going to get too many in the details. And that's for next episode. So you have to tune in for that one, Charlie.
I will be here and very interested. Again, I've just gone through all this. So awesome. Well, does that cover it with the how to determine the effective date of your real estate contract, or anything else you want to add?
Yeah, but I'm just going to read it one more time. So I think it's worth it. The effective date of the contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or the final counteroffer.
All right. Write that down, listeners. Well, again, another plug for you guys are awesome. Your team there. To learn more about Goodwin Law, FL as in Florida, estatelaw.com, or give them a ring, 239-207-3403. And Matt, we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks for listening to Goodwin Law Unplugged. To learn more about Goodwin Law and to utilize our services, visit GoodwinEstatelaw.com or call 239-207-3403. Hablamos Espanol. To submit questions or be a guest on a future episode, message us on our website or on social media by searching for Goodwin Law PA in Naples, Florida. This has been Goodwin Law Unplugged. Thanks again for joining us.